Most of us probably remember that old, "Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?" Those that are young enough that don't, maybe your cell coverage anymore is good enough you don't have that trouble, but we would go all over. So that kind of was the inspiration, I guess, in some ways to this today, to this lesson. There's been said that we go through two different phases in our spiritual journey. There's consolation and there's desolation. And consolation is when you can easily hear God's voice. You can see Him working in your life. You tend to be more joyful, happy. Things are just going the way they're supposed to be going. Obviously, that's where we all like to be. But many times we're in the desolation to where we aren't hearing God's voice very well. Sometimes we think, God, are you even listening? And that goes on. And those are some tough times. Somehow they're easier to recall the times when we don't hear God than when we do hear God. For some reason, those are easier for us to remember. I believe that all of us go through these desolate times, and I would venture to guess that there's some here in the congregation today that are going through these times when you are sending prayers up and you're not seeing them be answered, or you're not feeling His warmth around you. And that happens. And while I don't even try and pretend to know the mind of God, I have found that when I go through these desolate times, I grow spiritually. That's hard. And maybe that's why we go through them, is to let us to grow. It's easy to follow Him when we can see Him. It's not so easy when we can't. And it's tough. And it's hard. Turn to Psalm 46. Psalm 46 with me, please. We're going to be looking at verse 10. Psalm 46, verse 10. I'm using the New Living Translation. They could be slightly different, but most of these have the same basic thing. This is the translation that we use in the youth group. It's a little easier to understand at times. But Psalm 46, verse 10, and I'm just going to read the first part of it here in A. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am God. Well, when we have those desolate times, be still and know He's God. And that's tough. Many of you know me. Being still is not my high point. Okay? I'm not good at being still at all. It's very, very difficult for me. And yet, there are times when I have to be still and know that He is God. Those are tough. Pretty much that tells us everything we need to know in the desolate times. Be still and know He's God. Okay, message over. No, just teasing. Just teasing. We got more here. The first point I want you to know that God's silence is biblical. It's throughout the Bible we see God's silence. Many times. It's not new. You're not alone. You're not broke. There's nothing wrong with you. Just right at the time, maybe, you're not hearing God's voice. Turn to 1 Kings, the Old Testament here. 1 Kings chapter 18. We'll be looking at 1 Kings chapter 18. We're going to be looking at Elijah. And a little bit of pre-story here. Elijah has been told by God to go tell King Ahab that he's done wrong in the sight of God. He's done wrong against God, and that God is going to bring a drought upon his lands. Now, I don't think kings then were any different than some kings are today. They probably don't take well to a servant coming up and telling them there's going to be something going on. They don't handle that really well. They like to be in control of everything. And so they don't take it real well when a prophet comes and says, hey, you're doing wrong. And the king's like, who are you to tell me I'm doing wrong? You know, they don't take that very well. But Elijah had gone. He had told the king that, hey, you need to straighten up or there's going to be drought. And there was drought. So now when we look into chapter 18, and again, different translations will put this differently, but my translation says, later on, in the 3rd year of the drought, the Lord said to Elijah, go present yourself to King Ahab. Tell him that I will soon send rain. So Elijah went to appear before Ahab. So right there, and some translations have that a lot different. Some just say a long time passed, whatever. Mine says 3 years. After doing some study, it was 3 years. So I want you to think about this. God had told Elijah to go tell King Ahab there's going to be a drought. King didn't take that very well. Elijah had to basically run and hide for his life. He didn't hear from God for 3 years. God's prophet didn't hear from God for 3 years. Guys, I get anxiety when I don't hear from him for a week, okay? He didn't hear from him for 3 years. And yet, Elijah was faithful, stayed true, kept praying, kept working. God's silence was biblical. It's nothing new, nothing different. It's been there. It will continue to be there. I can imagine this whole time Elijah sending prayers up, scared, alone, the only prophet left in the land, all by himself and not hearing God's voice. Where we are blessed that we have a church family to go to. We have family, we have friends that we can rely on. Elijah was by himself, and he still trusted in God. But God's silence was there. Or maybe we think of King David, man after God's own heart, God's king. This great guy, there's no way that he would have ever known silence of God, right? There's just no way that God wouldn't speak to him like he probably had a cell phone number or something, you know. It's King David. Hello, God, you know, and just like that. But yet, if we turn to Psalm 42, Psalm 42, and we're going to look at verse 9. Psalm 42, verse 9. This is King David speaking here. Saul has been chasing him. His life is in danger all the time. Saul is trying to kill him, has sent assassins to try to kill David. He's in hiding. He knows he's the rightful king, but yet King Saul is still the king. And so he pens this psalm and starts out, Psalm 42, verse 9. O God, my rock, I cry, why have you forgotten me? Why must I wander in grief, oppressed by my enemies? King David, why have you forgotten me? The silence was deafening. King David's out there going, where are you at? You've told me I'm the king, and I can't even get you to answer my call. And it's just the way it is. There are times when you're going to go through and you're not going to hear God's voice clearly. It's biblical. It's not really strange. Next point I want to make is God's silence is personal. It's very personal. This one hurts a little. Okay? This one's going to touch somebody, maybe harshly. It's not my intent, but it's there. Are we being honest with ourselves? That's number one. Or has sin gotten so deep into our life that it has separated us from God and we cannot hear Him because we are all chasing down this sin and we've gone as far away from Him as we can get? We're still calling out to Him, but our sin has put this barrier right there. And He's trying to get a hold of us, but we're not listening because we're listening to the world. We're listening to all the other junk that's going on, and we're not listening for God's voice. We say we are, but do we have a clean heart? And are we really listening? Or have we put that barrier up? Have we made it hard for Him by putting that barrier there? Turn to Jonah, chapter 1. I think most of us know the story of Jonah, but just a little refresher. Jonah's a prophet again of God. So this is someone who God speaks directly to. And in Jonah chapter 1, starting with verse 1, the Lord gave this message to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go up and go to the city of Nineveh. Announce my judgment against it, because I have seen how wicked its people are. But Jonah got up and went in the opposite direction to get away from the Lord. He went down to the port of Joppa, where he found a ship leaving for Tarshish. He bought a ticket and went on board, hoping to escape from the Lord by sailing to Tarshish. Now, to give you an idea, we have Nineveh over here. Jonah gets on a ship and goes that way, as far and as fast as he can get. Okay? It wasn't that he didn't hear God's voice. He didn't want to obey God's voice. He didn't want to do what God was asking him to do. And in the silence, God's sitting there going, told you what to do. Go do it. But in the silence, he was just trying to run from God. And many of us get in that point. Let me tell you, folks, I've ran. I can tell you this, you can't outrun him. I can tell you that right now. You cannot outrun God. Before I became a youth pastor, I was in the automotive industry. For a lot of years, I was in the automotive industry. I had a good job. I enjoyed my job a lot. I was good at my job. I'm not being prideful, but I was good at my job. I loved it a lot. God called me to go work with the youth, and I didn't listen. I ran as hard and as fast. I went to Tarshish and beyond. I was going anywhere I could go, but not there. My life became hard. My wife will tell you I was the worst person in the world to live with. My job got hard. Everything about my life started crumbling down in front of me until I answered the call. And I decided to go work with the youth. And that's how I got started. But it's amazing how in that time of desolation, I didn't think I was hearing God's voice. I would pray, what's going on? Why is this happening? And at the same time, I knew in my heart, I knew what it was, but I wasn't listening. And many times, in our desolation, we have to be honest with ourselves. Are we listening for God's voice? Or have we tuned it out? And it's real easy to say, well, I just couldn't hear him. You know, and we can complain to others or whatever. I can't hear God's voice right now. Well, that can happen. It is biblical, but sometimes it's personal. And you need to examine yourself and find out it's personal. Remember that. Psalm 46:10. Be still and know that I am God. Even in those hard times, even when you're running, be still and know that I am God. We have to do that. The third point is God's silence is common. It's common. It's not strange. It's not weird. It's not out there. Like I said earlier, you're not broken. There's nothing wrong with you, okay, if we've examined ourselves and done that. It's common. We see it throughout the Bible. We see it throughout our friends. I think most of us have been honest. If we've went in our spiritual walk for a while, we've had a friend that says, I just can't hear him. I wish I was like you. I wish I could hear him. How do you hear God? What's going on? There's a story that goes like this. The devil, according to legend, once advertised his tools for sale at public auction. When the prospective buyers assembled, there was one oddly shaped tool which was labeled not for sale. Asked to explain why this was, the devil answered, I can spare all my other tools, but I cannot spare this one. It is my most useful implement I have. It's called discouragement. Satan uses that discouragement. And he gets in there. And he finds a little crack. And he just starts to widen that. And he starts to open it up. And it starts to get wider and wider and wider. And when we're in that desolation, we get to that point to where we start distrusting God. We're not listening. We start going, man, I don't know about this, man. This isn't right. This is just not right. And we just walk farther and farther and farther away until we're so far from the cross we can't hear him because we've gotten so far away from him. Unfortunately, this is pretty common because Satan knows how to use those tools. He knows how to use them well. He will even use Scripture and mess your head up. Okay? He did it to Jesus. What makes you think he's not going to do it to you? He used Scripture, again, tried to use it against Jesus. Of course, Jesus was strong enough that wasn't a problem. For many of us, we're a little weak. We don't have the strength that Jesus had many times. And are we calling out for him for that strength? Or are we just giving in to that when it gets tough and it gets hard? It is tough and it is hard. We perceive this silence from God, we have a tendency to doubt. But the big thing is, we can't stop communicating with God. What's your prayer life like? Just because he hasn't picked up what we perceive, pick up the phone and listen, he is listening. In fact, I know that. Turn to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. We made it to the New Testament. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. We're going to be looking at verses 16 through 18. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 16 through 18. And Paul is writing to the church of Thessalonica. I can't say it. My tongue isn't going right there. And he starts out with, always be joyful. Ouch. Now here's something. He's writing to the church, and he says always be joyful. That tells you something. They must not have been joyful, or else he wouldn't have had to tell them to be. So they were in desolation, right? They were in desolation. They were not listening. They weren't hearing God. They're upset. They're angry. Things aren't going well. And the first thing he says here is always be joyful. Never stop praying. Never stop praying. You can't stop the communication just because you think God isn't listening or you're not hearing God. Don't stop praying. Examine your prayer life. What is your prayer life like? Are we praying? Are you spending time? I know part of the 360 was spending 3 minutes a day in prayer. 3 minutes. That shouldn't be hard. But are you doing it? Okay? Next, be thankful in all circumstances. Ouch. Be thankful in all circumstances. Even when God is silent, be thankful in all circumstances. For this is God's will for you who belong to Christ Jesus. As Christians, we don't stop praying. Even in his silence, we don't stop praying. Even when you're not hearing that still voice, even when you don't see him working. I would argue that many times we don't see him working because we've so stuck ourselves into this desolation, and we kind of like this self-pity. We kind of like this grief. We stay down there when there's things going on around us all the time, and we're not paying attention. We're not seeing him because we're not looking for him. Okay? We don't try and find him. It's easier to stay down here than it is to seek after him. It's not easy. It's hard work. Okay? Again, that's when we grow. That's when we grow, is when we have to go seeking him. We have to go deeper. We have to go in that. Are we opening our Bible? Are we studying his word? Are we praying? Are we doing what he's told to do? Are we being joyful? Always be joyful. Pray. Curtis Jones writes, although the discipline of prayer, the pathway to God, may not bring the coveted miracle, the Christian is challenged to continue conversations with God. Not that the Father needs to be reminded of human problems so much as mankind needs to be reminded of God's presence and power. God does not need your prayers to be reminded of what's going on. He knows what's going on. He knows what's going on in your life. Exactly. He's just sitting there going, talk to me. Talk to me. I'm right here. All you got to do is call out and talk to me. And what have we put in the way to hear him? Have a clean heart. Think about it. Pray about it. Know that he's there. Be still and know that he is God.